Picture this. The year is 320 CE, and instead of Chinese armies marching west along the Silk Road, it's Indian war elephants thundering across the Himalayas, their mahouts scanning the horizon for the glittering spires of Chang'an. Instead of Buddhist monks carrying scriptures from India to China, it's Indian generals planning the conquest of the Middle Kingdom itself. What if the greatest empire in ancient Indian history had turned its gaze northward and decided that China wasn't just a trading partner, but a prize to be won? Welcome to a world where the Gupta Empire, at the height of its golden age, made a decision that would reshape the entire course of human civilization. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of history's most explosive what-if scenarios. What if ancient India conquered China? Now, before you think this is just some wild fantasy, let me tell you something that might shock you. The pieces were already on the board. The military might was there, the economic power was undeniable, and most importantly, the ambition of one particular ruler could have changed everything. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just how this conquest could have happened, but why it would have created a world so different from our own that modern history would be completely unrecognizable. But here's what makes this scenario absolutely mind-blowing. We're not just talking about one empire absorbing another. We're talking about the collision of two of humanity's most sophisticated civilizations at their absolute peak. The mathematical genius of ancient India meeting the administrative mastery of Imperial China. The spiritual depth of Hindu and Buddhist philosophy reshaping Confucian society. The artistic traditions of the subcontinent flooding into the land of the Yellow River. And I've spent months researching this, diving deep into military records, economic data, and political documents from both civilizations to show you exactly how this could have unfolded. Because when you look at the evidence, when you really examine what both empires were capable of during this crucial period, the possibility becomes not just plausible, but inevitable under the right circumstances. Let me paint you a picture of what we're dealing with here. It's the 4th century CE, and two superpowers are reaching their zenith simultaneously. In India, the Gupta Empire under Chandragupta II is experiencing what historians call the Golden Age of India. This isn't just political propaganda, this is measurable greatness. Their armies are battle-tested veterans who've crushed the Western Kshatrapas and pushed deep into Central Asia. Their economy is so robust that Roman gold coins flow into Indian treasuries at an unprecedented rate. Their cultural achievements, from the poetry of Kalidasa to the mathematical innovations of Aryabhata, are setting standards that won't be matched for centuries. Meanwhile, in China, the Jin dynasty is fracturing. The empire that once seemed unshakable is splitting apart like a rotten fruit. The Western Jin has collapsed entirely, and the Eastern Jin is barely holding on to power in the south, while northern China dissolves into chaos during what historians call the 16 Kingdoms period. This isn't just political instability, this is civilizational crisis. Nomadic tribes are carving up territories, warlords are declaring themselves emperors every few months, and the great Chinese war machine that had dominated East Asia for centuries is scattered to the winds. But here's where it gets interesting. Most historians look at this period and see two separate stories, two civilizations developing in isolation. They're missing the bigger picture. They're not seeing the moment when these two worlds could have collided with earth-shattering consequences. See, what if Chandragupta II, fresh from his victories in the West, had received intelligence about China's weakness? What if his spies, trading along the Silk Road, had reported back that the Middle Kingdom was ripe for conquest? What if, instead of consolidating his gains in India, he had decided to achieve something no Indian ruler had ever attempted, the conquest of China itself? The more I researched this scenario, the more I realized that all the pieces were in place for exactly this kind of ambitious campaign. The Gupta military was at its absolute peak, with innovations in cavalry tactics, siege warfare, and logistics that made them arguably the most effective fighting force in the world at that time. Their economy could sustain a massive military expedition, their administration was sophisticated enough to govern conquered territories, and most crucially, they had something the fractured Chinese kingdoms lacked: unity of purpose under visionary leadership. And here's what nobody talks about when they discuss ancient Indian history. The Guptas weren't just content with ruling the subcontinent. They had already proven their appetite for expansion by conquering territories far beyond traditional Indian boundaries. They had diplomatic relations with the Sassanid Empire, trade connections reaching all the way to Rome, and military expeditions that had pushed into Central Asia. This was an empire thinking on a global scale, and China represented the ultimate prize. But this isn't just about military conquest. What makes this scenario absolutely fascinating is what would have happened after the initial victories. Imagine Indian administrators implementing their decimal system and concept of zero throughout Chinese territories. Picture Hindu temples rising alongside Buddhist monasteries in cities like Luoyang and Kaifeng. Envision Sanskrit scholars working with Chinese intellectuals to create hybrid philosophical systems that combine Vedantic thought with Taoist principles. The cultural fusion alone would have been unprecedented in human history. We're talking about the mathematical sophistication of ancient India accelerating Chinese technological development by centuries. We're talking about Indian metallurgical techniques revolutionizing Chinese weapon making and agriculture. We're talking about the Indian understanding of astronomy and medicine transforming Chinese science. And the economic implications? Absolutely staggering. The Gupta Empire controlling both the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Road would have created the world's first truly global commercial network. Spices from Kerala reaching markets in Beijing under a single administrative system. Chinese silk flowing to Roman markets through Indian-controlled ports. The wealth generated by this unified economic zone would have dwarfed anything the ancient world had ever seen. But here's where this gets really mind-bending. The ripple effects wouldn't have stopped at India and China. A Gupta conquest of China would have fundamentally altered the balance of power across the entire ancient world. The Roman Empire, already struggling with barbarian invasions and internal strife, would have faced a unified Indo-Chinese superpower controlling the eastern end of all their trade routes. The Islamic expansion that began in the 7th century would have encountered a completely different geopolitical landscape, with a Hindu-Buddhist empire spanning from the Arabian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. This isn't just alternative history, this is alternative civilization. We're talking about a world where the centre of global power never shifted to Europe, where Eastern philosophy and science maintained their dominance, where the very concept of East versus West might never have developed because both would have been unified under Indian rule. Now I know what some of you might be thinking. Could this really have happened? Was ancient India actually capable of conquering and holding Chinese territory? The answer is going to surprise you, because when you look at the military capabilities, the economic resources and the political opportunities available to the Gupta Empire during its peak years, not only was this possible, it was probably inevitable if certain key decisions had been made differently. We're going to explore exactly how this conquest could have unfolded, from the initial intelligence gathering that would have revealed China's vulnerability, to the massive logistical operation required to move Indian armies across the Himalayas, to the brilliant tactical adaptations that would have been necessary to defeat Chinese forces on their home territory. But more than that, we're going to dive deep into what this alternative world would have looked like. How would Indian caste systems have interacted with Chinese social hierarchies? What kind of hybrid governmental system would have emerged from combining Gupta administrative practices with Chinese bureaucratic traditions? How would the fusion of Hindu, Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian thought have created entirely new philosophical schools? The implications stretch far beyond the ancient world. If India had conquered China in the 4th century, the entire trajectory of human development would have been altered. The scientific revolution might have happened in Delhi instead of London. The age of exploration could have been led by Indian navigators sailing from Chinese ports. The Industrial Revolution might have begun with Indian innovations in Chinese workshops. And here's something that's going to blow your mind. The technological prerequisites for this conquest already existed. The Gupta Empire had developed sophisticated siege engines, including early forms of gunpowder weapons that they had learned from Chinese traders and improved upon. They had cavalry units that could operate effectively in diverse terrain, from the deserts of Rajasthan to the mountains of Afghanistan. They had a logistical system capable of supplying armies thousands of miles from home, as proven by their successful campaigns in Central Asia. Most importantly, they had something that the fractured Chinese kingdoms of the 4th century lacked: the ability to adapt and innovate rapidly in response to new challenges. The Gupta military machine wasn't just powerful, it was flexible, capable of incorporating new tactics, new technologies, and new strategies as circumstances demanded. This is the story of how a decision made in the royal court at Pataliputra could have reshaped the entire course of human civilization. It's the story of what happens when ambition meets opportunity, when military genius encounters political chaos, when two great civilizations collide at the peak of their respective powers. So buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey through one of history's most explosive possibilities. We're going to see Indian war elephants charging through the streets of Chinese cities, Sanskrit inscriptions appearing on Chinese monuments, and a single empire spanning from the Malabar coast to the Great Wall. The conquest that could have changed everything is about to begin. The logistics alone would have been breathtaking in their audacity. Picture this: Chandragupta II, standing in his war council chamber at Pataliputra, maps of the known world spread before him like a chessboard. His generals cluster around the table as he traces a finger across the treacherous mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, through the valleys of Bactria, toward the fractured kingdoms of northern China. The conventional wisdom says it can't be done. The distances are too vast, the terrain too hostile, the enemy too entrenched on their home ground. But here's what makes this scenario absolutely electrifying. The Guptas had already proven they could do the impossible. Their conquest of the Shaka kingdoms in western India wasn't just a military victory, it was a masterclass in logistics and adaptation. They had moved massive armies across diverse terrain, supplied them over extended campaigns, and integrated conquered populations into their administrative system with ruthless efficiency. The infrastructure was already there. The expertise was already proven. All it needed was a target worthy of their ambition, and China in the 4th century CE was exactly that target. While the Eastern Jin dynasty clung to power in the south, northern China had exploded into chaos. The 16 Kingdoms period wasn't just political instability, it was civilizational breakdown on a scale that made even the fall of Rome look orderly by comparison. Former Zhao, later Zhao, former Qin, later Qin, kingdoms rising and falling like waves in a storm, warlords proclaiming themselves emperor one month, dead or dethroned the next. The great Chinese war machine that had conquered Vietnam and pushed into Central Asia was scattered across dozens of competing factions, each too busy fighting their neighbours to notice the growing power assembling to their southwest. But this is where most people get the story completely wrong. They think ancient warfare was just about who had the biggest army or the sharpest swords. That's medieval thinking applied to a classical problem. The Gupta Empire wasn't successful because they had more soldiers than their enemies, though they certainly had impressive numbers. They were successful because they had cracked the code of 4th century warfare, combined arms tactics, adaptive logistics, and most crucially, information warfare that would have made Sun Tzu himself take notes. Let me break this down for you, because when you understand how sophisticated Gupta military doctrine had become by Chandragupta II's reign, the idea of them conquering China stops sounding like fantasy and starts sounding like inevitability. First, intelligence gathering. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was an information superhighway. Indian merchants weren't just carrying spices and textiles to Chinese markets, they were bringing back detailed reports on political situations, military capabilities, economic conditions, and social tensions. The Guptas had agents, both official and unofficial, in every major Chinese city. They knew about the succession crises, the ethnic conflicts, the economic strain of constant warfare. They had better intelligence on Chinese capabilities than most Chinese rulers had on their own territories. Second, technological superiority. And I'm not talking about some mystical ancient Indian superweapons here. I'm talking about documented, archaeologically verified advantages that the Guptas possessed over their Chinese contemporaries. Their metallurgy was superior, producing steel that was harder and more flexible than anything being manufactured in China at the time. Their siege engines incorporated innovations learned from contact with Roman, Persian, and Central Asian military traditions, creating hybrid designs that could adapt to Chinese fortification styles. Most importantly, they had perfected the use of war elephants in diverse terrain, something no Chinese army had ever faced in serious numbers. Third, and this is the key that unlocks everything else, logistical innovation. The Guptas hadn't just conquered territories, they had developed systems for holding and administering them over vast distances. Their road networks, their communication systems, their methods for supplying armies in hostile territory. These weren't just military tools, they were civilizational technologies that gave them capabilities no other empire of their era possessed. Now here's where this gets really interesting. The route for invasion wasn't the obvious one. Everyone thinks about crossing the Himalayas directly, which would have been suicide even for an army as capable as the Guptas. But remember, the Gupta Empire at its peak controlled territories far beyond the Indian subcontinent. They had vassal states and trading posts throughout Central Asia, including regions that are now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. The invasion route wouldn't have been south to north across the world's highest mountains. It would have been west to east through the Silk Road corridors, following established trade routes with pre-positioned supply depots and friendly populations. Picture the campaign as it unfolds. Gupta advance forces, disguised as merchant caravans, begin moving through Central Asian routes in late 319 CE. These aren't just reconnaissance units, they're advanced logistics teams, establishing supply caches, negotiating with local rulers, mapping defensive positions around Chinese frontier cities. The main army doesn't move until spring 320 CE, by which time every major obstacle between Bactria and the Chinese border has been scouted, every river crossing identified, every potential alliance explored. The Chinese frontier defences, designed to handle nomadic raiders and rival Chinese armies, would have been completely unprepared for what was coming. They were expecting cavalry charges and siege warfare conducted according to established Chinese military doctrine. Instead, they faced combined arms tactics that integrated war elephants, heavy cavalry, specialised siege engineers, and coordinated infantry formations using weapons and techniques they had never encountered. But here's what makes this scenario truly explosive. The Guptas wouldn't have been trying to destroy Chinese civilization, they would have been trying to absorb it. This wasn't a barbarian invasion aimed at looting and burning. This was a sophisticated imperial project designed to create the world's first truly transcontinental empire. Every Chinese administrator who submitted would have been retained. Every Chinese technological innovation would have been studied and improved. Every Chinese cultural tradition would have been preserved and integrated into a hybrid system that combined the best of both civilizations. The siege of Chang'an, when it came, would have been unlike anything in military history. Chinese defenders expecting conventional siege tactics would have found themselves facing war elephants equipped with tower-mounted archers, siege engines that could breach walls thought impregnable, and most devastatingly, psychological warfare techniques that turned their own population against them. The Guptas had perfected the art of winning over conquered peoples, offering better administration, lower taxes, and religious tolerance in exchange for submission. Chinese cities wouldn't have fallen to assault. They would have opened their gates voluntarily, and once the military conquest was complete, that's when the real transformation would have begun. The administrative integration alone would have been a marvel of ancient statecraft. Imagine Gupta bureaucrats, trained in Sanskrit and versed in Hindu legal tradition, working alongside Chinese officials who had spent their careers mastering Confucian administrative theory. The hybrid system that emerged wouldn't have been purely Indian or purely Chinese. It would have been something entirely new, a governmental structure that combined the flexibility of Indian feudalism with the efficiency of Chinese bureaucracy. The economic implications would have been staggering. The Gupta Empire, controlling both the Indian Ocean trade routes and the Silk Road, would have created a commercial network spanning from Rome to Japan. Chinese silk moving through Indian ports to Mediterranean markets under a single administrative system. Indian spices reaching Chinese tables without the markup of multiple intermediaries. The wealth generated by this unified trade zone would have been unprecedented in the ancient world. But the cultural fusion, that's where this alternative history becomes truly mind-bending. We're not just talking about Indian rulers governing Chinese subjects, we're talking about the creation of an entirely new civilization, a hybrid culture that would have combined the mathematical sophistication of ancient India with the technological innovation of Imperial China. Sanskrit scholars working with Chinese intellectuals to develop new philosophical systems, Hindu and Buddhist temples rising alongside Confucian academies, Indian musical traditions blending with Chinese instruments to create art forms that never existed in our timeline. The ripple effects would have spread far beyond the borders of this new super-empire. The Roman Empire, already struggling with barbarian invasions and economic crisis, would have faced a unified Indo-Chinese power, controlling the eastern terminus of all their trade routes. The terms of exchange would have been dictated from Delhi and Beijing, not negotiated between dozens of competing kingdoms. Roman gold would have flowed east in even greater quantities, accelerating the economic collapse that historically took centuries to unfold. Meanwhile, the nomadic tribes of Central Asia, who in our timeline eventually conquered both Indian and Chinese territories, would have found themselves facing a unified empire with the resources and military sophistication to push them back into the steppes permanently. The Hun invasions that terrorized Europe might never have happened, because the Huns themselves would have been contained or absorbed by Indo-Chinese frontier forces, And here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The technological acceleration that would have resulted from this cultural fusion could have triggered an early scientific revolution. Indian mathematical concepts, including the decimal system and the concept of zero, applied to Chinese engineering and metallurgy. Chinese innovations in papermaking and printing combined with Indian traditions of scholarship and debate. The Library of Alexandria might have been overshadowed by research centres in Pataliputra or Chang'an that combined the intellectual traditions of both civilizations. The religious implications alone would have reshaped the spiritual development of humanity. Buddhism, which historically spread from India to China gradually over centuries, would have become the official philosophical system of a unified empire spanning both regions. But this wouldn't have been the Buddhism we know from history. This would have been a hybrid system that incorporated Confucian ethical principles, Hindu metaphysical concepts, and Taoist practical wisdom into something entirely unprecedented. Imagine the architectural marvels that would have emerged from this fusion. Indian temple building techniques applied to Chinese pagoda design, Hindu sculptural traditions integrated with Chinese landscape painting, palace complexes that combine the geometric precision of Indian architecture with the environmental harmony of Chinese garden design. The ruins of these hybrid monuments would have surpassed anything built by Rome or Persia. The military technologies developed by this empire would have been centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. Chinese innovations in crossbow design enhanced by Indian metallurgy. War elephants equipped with Chinese-designed armour and weapons. Siege engines that combined Indian mechanical principles with Chinese engineering precision. Any force that tried to challenge this empire would have been facing weapons and tactics that wouldn't appear elsewhere for hundreds of years. But perhaps most significantly, the unified Indo-Chinese empire would have created a different relationship between East and West. Instead of the gradual Western dominance that characterized our timeline, we would have seen Eastern philosophical and scientific traditions maintaining their supremacy well into what we call the medieval period. The Islamic expansion of the 7th and 8th centuries would have encountered a unified Hindu-Buddhist empire that controlled territory from the Arabian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The Crusades might never have happened because the balance of power would have remained firmly tilted toward the East. The very concept of European exceptionalism that drove the Age of Exploration and the colonial period would never have developed because European traders would have remained junior partners in a global economy dominated by Indo-Chinese commercial networks. The scientific revolution might have occurred in Delhi or Beijing rather than London or Paris. The Industrial Revolution could have begun with Indian innovations in Chinese workshops rather than English mills. This isn't just alternative military history, this is alternative human development, a completely different trajectory for our species based on a single decision made in a royal court in ancient India. The conquest that could have changed everything was not just possible, it was probable under the right circumstances. And those circumstances existed in the 4th century CE, when ambition met opportunity, when military genius encountered political chaos, when two great civilizations stood poised to become one. Now let me tell you about the moment that would have changed everything. It's early 320 CE, and Chandragupta II receives a dispatch from his spy master that makes his blood run cold with excitement. The intelligence is almost too good to believe. The former Zhao kingdom in northern China is collapsing from within. Their emperor, Liu Yao, is facing simultaneous rebellions in 3 provinces. Their capital at Chang'an is under siege by rival Chinese factions. Their army is scattered across 1,000 miles of territory, trying to fight wars on multiple fronts. But here's the detail that makes Chandragupta's eyes light up with predatory focus. Liu Yao has sent desperate envoys to every neighbouring kingdom, offering tributary status, territorial concessions, even marriage alliances to anyone who will send military aid. The Great Middle Kingdom, the civilization that had dominated East Asia for over 500 years, was begging for help from barbarian tribes. This is the moment when alternative history pivots on a single decision. In our timeline, Chandragupta II chose to consolidate his Western conquests, to focus on internal development and cultural flowering. It was a wise choice that led to India's golden age. But what if he had seen this intelligence differently? What if, instead of thinking like a king securing his borders, he had thought like an emperor eyeing the ultimate prize? Picture the war council that night, the torches casting dancing shadows on the walls of the strategy chamber as Chandragupta paces before his assembled generals. These aren't court flatterers. These are battle-hardened veterans who have carved an empire from the chaos of post-Kushan India. General Skandagupta, fresh from crushing the last Shaka resistance, argues for caution. The distances are vast, he says. The terrain is treacherous. Why risk everything on such an ambitious gamble? But then General Panagupta speaks up, and his words carry the weight of a man who has never lost a campaign. "My lord," he says, his voice cutting through the debate like a blade, "when will we ever again face an enemy so divided, so desperate, so perfectly positioned for conquest? The Chinese kingdoms are fighting each other instead of preparing to fight us. Their armies are scattered, their treasuries depleted, their people war-weary. If we wait for a more perfect opportunity, we will wait forever." And here's where Chandragupta's genius would have shone through, because the decision he makes next reveals something crucial about how this conquest could have succeeded. He doesn't order an immediate invasion. Instead, he does something far more sophisticated, something that shows why the Guptas weren't just another warrior dynasty, but the architects of a true empire. He orders what we might call the greatest intelligence operation in ancient history. Over the next 6 months, Gupta agents flood into China, not as invaders, but as merchants, pilgrims, and refugees fleeing the chaos in Central Asia. They establish trading posts in border cities, build relationships with local officials, map military installations, and most importantly, begin spreading a very specific message: that the great Emperor of India is seeking worthy allies in his struggle against the nomadic barbarians threatening civilized lands everywhere. This isn't just psychological warfare, this is civilizational seduction. The Guptas position themselves not as conquerors, but as the saviors of Chinese civilization, the rightful heirs to the mandate of heaven that the fractured kingdoms have obviously lost. They offer Chinese officials something their own rulers can't provide: competent administration, economic stability, and protection from the nomadic tribes that have been ravaging the northern frontiers. By late 320 CE, when the main Gupta army finally begins moving east through the Silk Road corridors, they're not marching into hostile territory. They're advancing through a landscape prepared for their arrival, where local populations have been convinced that Indian rule represents salvation rather than conquest. Chinese garrison commanders open their gates not because they've been defeated in battle, but because they've been offered better terms of service under Gupta administration than they ever received from their own emperors. The psychological impact of this approach cannot be overstated. When the first Gupta war elephants appear on the horizon outside a Chinese city, the defenders don't see instruments of destruction. They see symbols of legitimate imperial power, the kind of majestic authority that their own fractured kingdoms have clearly lost. The sight of these massive beasts decorated with Indian royal regalia and carrying towers filled with disciplined soldiers sends a message that transcends language barriers. Real emperors have arrived to restore order, but let's talk about what happens when diplomacy ends and the actual fighting begins, because this is where the Gupta military machine would have shown its true superiority. The Chinese kingdoms of the 4th century were certainly formidable opponents, with centuries of military tradition and technological innovation behind them. But they were fighting according to doctrines developed for wars against other Chinese armies and nomadic raiders. They had never faced an enemy that combined the tactical flexibility of Indian warfare with the technological sophistication of a truly cosmopolitan empire. The siege of Luoyang in early 321 CE would have been a masterpiece of adaptive tactics. The city's defenders, expecting conventional Chinese siege warfare, prepare for the standard approach, surrounding the city, cutting off supplies, and attempting to breach the walls through direct assault or tunneling. Instead, they face something completely unprecedented in Chinese military history. The Gupta siege begins not with an attack on the walls, but with a systematic dismantling of the city's external infrastructure. War elephants, protected by specially designed armour, demolish the aqueducts that supply fresh water to the city. Gupta engineers, trained in both Indian and Persian siege techniques, divert the rivers that power the city's mills and workshops. Most devastatingly, Gupta cavalry units equipped with composite bows systematically eliminate any Chinese force that tries to break out and restore these supply lines. This isn't just military superiority, this is operational art at a level that won't be seen again until the campaigns of Belisarius or Khalid ibn al-Walid. The Guptas aren't just besieging Luoyang, they're deconstructing it, turning the city's own infrastructure against its defenders while maintaining their own supply lines through a network of prepositioned depots stretching back to Central Asia. When the walls finally come under direct attack, The Chinese defenders face weapons and tactics they've never encountered. Gupta siege engines, incorporating design elements learned from Roman, Persian, and Central Asian traditions, can breach fortifications that have withstood conventional Chinese siege warfare for decades. But more than that, the psychological impact of war elephants equipped with tower-mounted catapults and flame-throwing devices creates panic among defenders who have no doctrine for dealing with such weapons. The city falls not through starvation or successful assault, but through negotiated surrender. The Chinese commander offered the choice between destruction and integration into the Gupta administrative system, chooses preservation. His soldiers are incorporated into Gupta forces, his administrators are retained under Indian supervision, and the city's population discovers that their new rulers offer lower taxes, better infrastructure maintenance, and more effective protection against nomadic raids than their previous Chinese overlords. This pattern repeats across northern China as the Gupta advance continues. City after city chooses submission over destruction, not because their defenders lack courage, but because the terms of surrender are so attractive compared to the chaos of continued warfare between fractured Chinese kingdoms. The Guptas aren't destroying Chinese civilization, they're offering to perfect it, to restore the unity and prosperity that the mandate of heaven was supposed to provide. By the end of 321 CE, when Gupta forces reach the approaches to Chang'an itself, they're no longer leading a foreign invasion. They're heading a legitimacy movement that has gained momentum with each victory. Chinese officials who initially fled before the Indian advance are now returning to negotiate terms of service under the new order. Local populations who had suffered under years of warfare between rival kingdoms welcome the stability that Gupta administration promises. The siege of Chang'an would have been the culmination of this strategy, and it would have been unlike any siege in military history. When Chandragupta Thasenda himself arrives before the city walls in spring 322 CE, he's not commanding a barbarian horde seeking to loot and burn. He's presenting himself as the legitimate emperor of a unified realm that stretches from the Deccan to the Yellow River, offering the defenders of Chang'an the chance to join the restoration of imperial order rather than die defending a failed system. The psychological warfare alone would have been devastating. Imagine the impact on Chinese morale when they see not just Indian war elephants, but Chinese cavalry units fighting alongside them under Gupta banners. When they hear not just Sanskrit war chants, but Chinese officers calling for surrender in their own language, explaining that resistance means defending chaos against order, division against unity, the failed past against the promising future, the city's fall would have been inevitable. But more than that, it would have been voluntary. The last defenders of the former Zhao dynasty, looking out from their walls at an army that represents successful imperial administration rather than foreign conquest, would have made the same calculation as every other Chinese official who had faced this choice. Better to serve competent rulers than to die for incompetent ones. And that's when the real transformation would have begun, because conquering China was only the first phase of this alternative history. The administrative integration that followed would have been the most ambitious governmental project in human history up to that point. Imagine the challenges. How do you govern an empire that spans from tropical India to temperate China? How do you integrate two completely different administrative traditions, two different legal systems, two different concepts of imperial legitimacy? The Gupta solution would have been brilliant in its pragmatism. Rather than imposing Indian systems on Chinese territories, they would have created a hybrid administration that preserved the best elements of both traditions. Chinese bureaucrats trained in Confucian administrative theory would have continued managing local governance under the supervision of Indian governors, who brought Gupta expertise in military organization and economic coordination. The legal system that emerged would have been revolutionary. Indian concepts of dharma, with their emphasis on duty and cosmic order, merged with Chinese ideas of li, the proper relationships that maintain social harmony. The result wouldn't have been purely Indian or purely Chinese law, but something entirely new, a legal framework that combined the philosophical depth of Hindu jurisprudence with the practical efficiency of Chinese administrative procedure. But here's where this alternative history becomes truly mind-bending. The cultural synthesis that would have emerged from this political union. We're not just talking about Indian rulers governing Chinese subjects. We're talking about the creation of an entirely new civilization, a hybrid culture that would have accelerated human development by centuries. The intellectual renaissance alone would have been unprecedented. Imagine the library of Pataliputra, already famous throughout the ancient world for its Sanskrit manuscripts and mathematical treatises, suddenly gaining access to Chinese innovations in papermaking, printing, and bibliographic organization. Indian scholars, with their sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy, collaborating with Chinese intellectuals who had perfected metallurgy, engineering, and natural philosophy. The technological breakthroughs that would have resulted from this collaboration could have triggered an early scientific revolution. Chinese innovations in mechanical engineering enhanced by Indian mathematical precision. Indian medical knowledge, including advanced surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations, combined with Chinese understanding of anatomy and physiological theory. The hybrid technologies that emerged from this fusion would have been centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. And the artistic achievements, those would have created entirely new aesthetic traditions. Indian sculptural techniques applied to Chinese architectural principles, Hindu and Buddhist iconography integrated with Confucian symbolic systems, musical traditions that combined Indian ragas with Chinese instrumental techniques. The artistic monuments of this hybrid civilization would have rivaled anything produced by Greece or Rome, but with a sophistication that drew from two of humanity's most advanced cultural traditions rather than just one. The economic implications of this cultural fusion would have been staggering. The unified Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't just have controlled trade routes, it would have revolutionized the very concept of commerce. Indian expertise in maritime navigation combined with Chinese innovations in land-based transportation. Indian understanding of monsoon patterns and ocean currents merged with Chinese knowledge of overland logistics and supply chain management. The merchant networks that emerged from this fusion would have created the world's first truly global economy, with trade relationships stretching from Roman Britain to the islands of Southeast Asia, all coordinated through a single administrative system that could guarantee safe passage, standardized weights and measures, and reliable commercial law across distances that other civilizations could barely imagine. But perhaps most significantly, this unified empire would have created a completely different relationship between political power and intellectual achievement. The Gupta tradition of royal patronage for scholars and artists, combined with Chinese respect for learning and bureaucratic merit, would have produced a governmental system where intellectual capability was the primary qualification for political advancement. Imagine universities in Delhi and Chang'an, where students studied Sanskrit literature alongside Chinese philosophy, where mathematical innovations were immediately applied to engineering projects, where astronomical observations were used to improve agricultural techniques and navigation methods. The intellectual elite of this hybrid civilization would have been centuries ahead of their counterparts in Europe, creating technologies and theoretical frameworks that might not have appeared in our timeline until the Renaissance or even later. This is the world that hung in the balance during those crucial months of 320 CE, when a single decision in the Gupta court could have reshaped the entire trajectory of human civilization. The conquest that would have changed everything was not just militarily possible, it was culturally inevitable once the initial political barriers were overcome. The administrative genius required to hold this empire together would have been staggering, and here's where most people completely misunderstand how ancient empires actually functioned. They picture some Indian Maharaja sitting on a throne in Pataliputra, issuing decrees that somehow magically get enforced in Chinese villages thousands of miles away. That's not how any of this works. Real imperial administration in the ancient world was about creating systems that could function autonomously while maintaining loyalty to the centre. The Guptas had already proven they understood this principle through their management of diverse territories across the Indian subcontinent. They didn't impose uniform Hindu practices on every conquered region. Instead, they created what we might call administrative federalism, where local customs and traditions were preserved within an overarching imperial framework that provided military protection, economic coordination, and legal arbitration. Now imagine scaling this system up to include Chinese territories with their own deeply entrenched bureaucratic traditions. The hybrid administration that would have emerged wouldn't have been Indian officials ruling Chinese subjects, or Chinese bureaucrats serving Indian masters. It would have been something entirely unprecedented, a genuinely bicultural governmental system where both traditions contributed their strengths to create something superior to either one alone. Picture the provincial governor of what was formerly the former Zhao Kingdom. He's a Chinese official trained in Confucian administrative theory who has spent his career mastering the intricate procedures of imperial bureaucracy. But now he's working alongside an Indian deputy who brings Gupta expertise in military logistics, trade regulation, and multi-ethnic population management. The Chinese official provides continuity and local knowledge. The Indian deputy ensures integration with broader imperial policies and access to resources from across the unified empire. This isn't just theoretical speculation. We can see exactly how this would have worked by looking at how the Guptas managed their western conquests against the Shakas. They didn't replace Shaka administrators wholesale. Instead, they created joint administrative councils where Shaka officials continued managing local affairs, while Gupta supervisors coordinated with the broader imperial system. The result was more efficient governance than either group could have achieved alone. But here's where this gets really fascinating: the legal innovations that would have emerged from this administrative fusion. Chinese law, based on detailed written codes and procedural precedents, meeting Indian dharmic principles that emphasized cosmic justice and social harmony. The hybrid legal system that emerged wouldn't have been a compromise between two traditions. It would have been a synthesis that solved problems neither system could handle alone. Consider how property disputes would have been resolved. Chinese law provided detailed procedures for determining ownership and inheritance rights. Indian dharmic tradition offered sophisticated frameworks for balancing individual claims against community needs and cosmic order. A legal system that combined both approaches could have created property law that was simultaneously more precise than Chinese precedent and more flexible than Indian custom. The criminal justice system would have been even more revolutionary. Chinese emphasis on deterrence through consistent punishment merged with Indian concepts of rehabilitation through understanding karmic consequences. We're talking about legal innovations that wouldn't appear in European jurisprudence until the Enlightenment, implemented in the 4th century CE across the world's largest empire. And the economic regulations, those would have been absolutely groundbreaking. The Guptas had developed sophisticated systems for managing long-distance trade, including standardized weights and measures, quality certification procedures, and dispute resolution mechanisms that could handle commercial disagreements across vast distances and cultural differences. Chinese administrators brought equally advanced techniques for taxation, public works management, and resource allocation. The unified commercial code that emerged from combining these systems would have revolutionized ancient commerce. Imagine a merchant in southern India knowing that the same legal protections, the same commercial standards, the same dispute resolution procedures that protected his business in Delhi would also apply to his operations in Chang'an or Luoyang. The reduction in transaction costs alone would have accelerated economic development across the entire empire. But let's talk about something even more mind-blowing: the technological acceleration that would have resulted from this administrative integration. The Guptas weren't just political administrators, they were systematic innovators who understood that technological advancement was essential for imperial success. Their metallurgy was superior to anything else in their era. Their engineering techniques had been proven in massive irrigation projects and urban construction. Their mathematical innovations were centuries ahead of European developments. Now picture these Indian technological traditions encountering Chinese innovations that were equally advanced but focused on different problems. Chinese expertise in mechanical engineering, paper production, and precision manufacturing meeting Indian mastery of chemistry, mathematics, and materials science. The hybrid technologies that emerged wouldn't have been simple combinations of existing techniques. They would have been entirely new approaches that neither civilization could have developed alone. The printing revolution alone would have been incredible. Chinese innovations in papermaking and woodblock printing combined with Indian traditions of scholarly debate and mathematical notation. Instead of printing being used primarily for religious texts and government proclamations, as it was in historical China, the Indo-Chinese Empire would have used it for rapid distribution of scientific treatises, mathematical innovations, and technical manuals. Imagine the impact on education and knowledge distribution. Sanskrit mathematical texts printed on Chinese paper and distributed through imperial administrative networks to schools in both India and China. Chinese engineering manuals translated into Sanskrit and used to train Indian craftsmen. Hybrid textbooks that combined Indian philosophical inquiry with Chinese practical application. The scientific method itself might have emerged centuries earlier than it did in our timeline. Indian traditions of logical debate and hypothesis testing merged with Chinese emphasis on empirical observation and systematic record-keeping. The natural philosophy that developed from this combination would have been far more rigorous than anything produced by individual ancient civilizations. And here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. The medical advances that would have resulted from this knowledge fusion. Indian understanding of surgery, pharmaceutical preparation, and diagnostic techniques was already the most advanced in the ancient world. Chinese medicine brought equally sophisticated approaches to anatomy, physiological theory, and therapeutic intervention. The hybrid medical system that emerged would have been performing surgical procedures and treating diseases that European medicine wouldn't master until the Renaissance. Picture hospitals in Delhi and Chang'an, where Indian surgical techniques were enhanced by Chinese anatomical knowledge, where Chinese acupuncture was guided by Indian understanding of physiological systems, where pharmaceutical preparations combined the botanical expertise of both traditions. The life expectancy and quality of healthcare in this empire would have been centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. The agricultural implications would have been equally revolutionary. Indian expertise in crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management combined with Chinese innovations in tool design, pest control, and food preservation. The agricultural productivity of the unified empire would have supported population densities that wouldn't be achieved elsewhere until the medieval period. But perhaps most importantly, the administrative systems that managed all this innovation would have created the world's first genuinely meritocratic bureaucracy. The Chinese tradition of selecting officials through competitive examinations merged with Indian emphasis on dharmic duty and cosmic justice. The result would have been a governmental system where advancement was based on demonstrated competence rather than birth, wealth, or political connections. Imagine the human capital development that would have resulted from this system. Talented individuals from across the empire, regardless of their ethnic background or regional origin, competing for administrative positions based on their mastery of both Indian and Chinese intellectual traditions. The quality of governance would have been unprecedented in the ancient world. The military applications of this administrative sophistication would have made the empire virtually unconquerable. The Gupta military system, already superior to anything else in their era, enhanced by Chinese innovations in logistics, engineering, and strategic planning. War elephants equipped with Chinese-designed armor and weapons, siege engines that combined Indian mechanical principles with Chinese precision manufacturing, intelligence networks that used both Indian psychological warfare techniques and Chinese systematic information gathering. Any external threat to this empire would have faced military capabilities that were centuries ahead of their own. The nomadic tribes that historically conquered both Indian and Chinese territories would have found themselves confronting a unified force with superior technology, better organization, and vastly greater resources. The ripple effects would have extended far beyond the empire's borders. The Roman Empire, already struggling with economic crisis and barbarian invasions, would have faced a completely different strategic environment. Instead of profitable trade relationships with divided Asian kingdoms, they would have confronted a unified Indo-Chinese power that controlled all the luxury goods they desperately needed. The terms of trade would have been dictated from Delhi and Chang'an, not negotiated between dozens of competing regional powers. Roman gold would have flowed eastward even faster than it did historically, accelerating the economic collapse that contributed to the fall of the Western Empire. But more than that, the technological and administrative innovations of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have provided alternative models of governance that could have influenced Roman political development. The Islamic expansion that began in the 7th century would have encountered a completely different world. Instead of conquering fractured Persian and Byzantine territories, Islamic armies would have faced a unified Hindu-Buddhist empire that controlled territory from the Arabian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The religious and cultural synthesis that emerged from Islamic conquest might never have occurred, because the balance of power would have remained firmly tilted toward Eastern philosophical and political traditions. The very concept of religious warfare that characterized medieval Europe and the Middle East might never have developed, because the Indo-Chinese Empire would have demonstrated that multiple religious and philosophical traditions could coexist within a single political framework. The religious tolerance that the Guptas had already shown toward Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions would have extended to include Chinese Confucian and Taoist practices, creating a genuinely pluralistic civilization. The long-term implications for human development would have been staggering. The scientific revolution that began in Europe during the 16th century might have occurred in India or China during the 8th or 9th centuries. The age of exploration that led to European colonialism might have been led by Indo-Chinese navigators sailing from ports that controlled both the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The Industrial Revolution itself might have begun with Indian innovations in Chinese workshops, powered by the vast resources and unified markets of the world's largest empire. The trajectory of technological development that we associate with European exceptionalism could have been an Eastern phenomenon, driven by the intellectual and material resources of a civilization that combined the best of both Indian and Chinese traditions. This isn't just alternative military history or political speculation. This is alternative human development, a completely different path for our species based on decisions that could have been made in the royal courts of ancient India. The administrative, technological and cultural synthesis that would have emerged from Indo-Chinese unification would have accelerated human progress by centuries, creating a world where Eastern philosophical and scientific traditions maintained their dominance well into what we call the modern period. The foundations for this alternative timeline existed in the 4th century CE, when the Gupta Empire possessed the military capability, administrative sophistication, and economic resources necessary to achieve the conquest of China. The opportunity was there, presented by Chinese political fragmentation and military weakness. The technological and cultural prerequisites were in place. All it would have taken was a single decision by Chandragupta II to look beyond the traditional boundaries of Indian ambition and recognize that the ultimate prize lay not in further Western conquests, but in the unification of the world's two most advanced civilizations under Indian leadership. That decision, made in a moment of historical possibility, could have changed the entire trajectory of human civilization. The administrative challenges of managing such a vast empire would have required innovations that we can barely comprehend today. Picture the communications network alone. Messages travelling from the Gupta court in Pataliputra to Chinese provincial governors in what is now Gansu province, covering distances of over 3,000 miles through terrain that range from tropical jungles to high mountain passes to arid steppes. The logistics of maintaining governmental coherence across such distances would have demanded technological solutions that were centuries ahead of their time. But here's what makes this scenario absolutely fascinating. The Guptas had already begun developing these solutions through their existing territorial administration. Their empire already stretched from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal, incorporating regions with radically different climates, languages, and cultural traditions. They had created what we might call the world's first truly federal system, where local autonomy coexisted with central coordination through a network of roads, relay stations, and administrative protocols that kept information flowing across vast distances. Now imagine scaling this system up to include Chinese territories. The hybrid communication network that would have emerged wouldn't have been simply Indian methods applied to Chinese distances. It would have been a fusion of Indian organizational principles with Chinese innovations in record-keeping, message encryption, and bureaucratic procedure. The result would have been an information system more sophisticated than anything that existed anywhere else in the ancient world. The Chinese had already developed remarkable innovations in governmental communication. Their postal relay system, with its standardized procedures for message authentication and delivery verification, was arguably the most efficient in the ancient world. But it was designed to serve a centralized empire where all authority flowed from a single capital. The Indian system, by contrast, was designed to coordinate between multiple centers of authority while maintaining overall imperial unity. The fusion of these two approaches would have created something revolutionary, a genuinely networked administration, where information could flow not just from center to periphery, but between different regions directly. A drought in Gandhara could trigger immediate grain shipments from the Yangtze Valley without requiring approval from Pataliputra. A nomadic incursion on the northern frontier could mobilize defensive forces from both Indian and Chinese territories simultaneously. But let's talk about something even more mind-blowing: the intellectual revolution that would have resulted from this administrative integration. The Chinese bureaucratic tradition wasn't just about managing territories and collecting taxes. It was fundamentally an intellectual project, based on the idea that good governance required deep understanding of literature, philosophy, history, and natural science. Chinese officials were selected through competitive examinations that tested not just their administrative competence, but their mastery of the entire intellectual tradition of Chinese civilization. Now picture this examination system encountering Indian traditions of scholarly debate and philosophical inquiry. The hybrid educational system that emerged wouldn't have been Chinese classics taught to Indian students, or Sanskrit texts studied by Chinese scholars. It would have been an entirely new curriculum that combined the systematic rigor of Chinese scholarship with the speculative depth of Indian philosophy. Imagine the entrance examination for the Imperial Administrative Service in this unified empire. Candidates would need to demonstrate mastery of both Confucian ethical theory and Hindu dharmic principles. They would need to solve mathematical problems using both Chinese computational methods and Indian decimal notation. They would need to compose poetry that met both Chinese formal requirements and Sanskrit prosodic standards. They would need to analyse historical examples drawn from both Indian and Chinese precedents. The intellectual elite that emerged from this system would have been unlike anything the world had ever seen. These wouldn't have been narrow specialists trained in a single cultural tradition. They would have been genuinely cosmopolitan intellectuals, equally at home discussing the Analects of Confucius and the Upanishads, capable of applying Indian mathematical innovations to Chinese engineering problems, able to draw on historical examples from both civilizations to solve contemporary administrative challenges. The scientific advances that would have resulted from this intellectual fusion are almost impossible to calculate. Chinese empiricism enhanced by Indian theoretical sophistication, Indian mathematical insight applied to Chinese technological problems. The hybrid natural philosophy that emerged would have been conducting controlled experiments and formulating general laws centuries before the European scientific revolution. Consider what would have happened to astronomy, a field where both civilizations had already made remarkable advances. Chinese astronomers had developed sophisticated instruments for celestial observation and had compiled detailed records of planetary motions, eclipses, and stellar phenomena. Indian mathematicians had created geometric models that could predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy, and had developed trigonometric techniques that wouldn't appear in European mathematics until the medieval period. The fusion of these traditions would have produced astronomical science that was centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. Indian geometric models enhanced by Chinese observational precision, Chinese instrumental techniques guided by Indian mathematical theory. The hybrid astronomy that emerged would have been making discoveries about planetary motion, stellar distances, and celestial mechanics that European astronomers wouldn't achieve until the Renaissance. And here's something that will absolutely blow your mind: the navigational implications of these astronomical advances. The Guptas were already accomplished maritime traders, with commercial networks that stretched from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia. Chinese shipbuilding technology was arguably the most advanced in the world, with innovations in hull design, sail configuration, and navigational equipment that wouldn't appear elsewhere for centuries. The combination of Indian oceanic expertise with Chinese shipbuilding innovations would have produced a naval capability that could have circumnavigated the globe centuries before Columbus. Indo-Chinese vessels, equipped with advanced astronomical instruments and guided by mathematical models that could predict celestial positions anywhere on Earth, would have been capable of oceanic voyages that other civilizations couldn't even imagine. Picture the implications for global exploration and trade. Instead of European ships reaching the Americas in 1492, we might have seen Indo-Chinese expeditions arriving on the western coasts of North and South America in the 8th or 9th centuries. The indigenous civilizations of the Americas would have encountered not European conquistadors seeking gold and territory, but sophisticated Asian traders interested in establishing commercial relationships and sharing technological innovations. The entire trajectory of global development would have been fundamentally altered. The demographic catastrophe that befell Native American populations through exposure to Old World diseases would still have occurred, but within the context of a more sophisticated and less exploitative contact situation. The technological and agricultural innovations that the Indo-Chinese Empire had developed through centuries of managing diverse populations across vast territories would have been applied to American conditions, potentially accelerating indigenous technological development rather than destroying indigenous societies. But let's bring this back to the immediate consequences of the conquest itself, because the cultural synthesis that would have emerged in the years immediately following Gupta victory would have been unlike anything in human history. We're not just talking about political unification or administrative integration, we're talking about the creation of entirely new forms of human expression that drew on the deepest traditions of both civilizations. The architectural revolution alone would have been breathtaking. Indian temple architecture with its sophisticated understanding of geometry, proportion, and symbolic meaning, encountering Chinese innovations in wood construction, landscape integration, and environmental harmony. The hybrid architectural style that emerged wouldn't have been Indian temples with Chinese decorative elements or Chinese pagodas with Indian sculptural programs. It would have been something entirely new, a built environment that expressed philosophical and aesthetic principles that neither civilization could have developed alone. Imagine walking through the capital city of this unified empire, perhaps a new foundation built at the geographic center of the combined territories. The palace complexes would have combined Indian understanding of cosmic symbolism with Chinese mastery of landscape design. Temple compounds would have integrated Hindu iconographic programs with Buddhist philosophical principles and Confucian ethical teachings. Market districts would have featured architectural innovations that accommodated both Indian trading practices and Chinese commercial customs. The urban planning itself would have been revolutionary. Indian cities, with their organic growth patterns and neighborhood-based social organization, meeting Chinese traditions of geometric layout and hierarchical spatial arrangement. The hybrid urban design that emerged would have solved problems of large-scale city management that wouldn't be addressed elsewhere until the modern period. But perhaps most significantly, the social innovations that would have emerged from this cultural fusion would have created new forms of human organization that transcended the limitations of both parent civilizations. The Indian caste system, with its sophisticated understanding of social specialization and religious duty, encountering Chinese concepts of meritocratic advancement and administrative hierarchy. The hybrid social system that emerged wouldn't have been simply Indian castes applied to Chinese territories or Chinese bureaucratic ranks imposed on Indian populations. It would have been something entirely new, a social framework that preserved the benefits of specialization and traditional knowledge while creating opportunities for individual advancement based on demonstrated competence. Picture how this would have worked in practice. A talented individual born into a traditional craft family in what had been a Chinese territory could have advanced through the educational system to administrative positions that drew on both their inherited skills and their acquired learning. Meanwhile, someone from an Indian Brahmin background could have applied their traditional scholarly training to mastering Chinese technological innovations, creating hybrid expertise that served the broader imperial system. The marriage customs, legal procedures, and social rituals that emerged from this synthesis would have been equally revolutionary. Indian concepts of dharmic duty and cosmic order merged with Chinese ideas about social harmony and proper relationships. The result would have been social structures that were simultaneously more flexible than traditional Indian arrangements and more spiritually meaningful than conventional Chinese hierarchies. The religious synthesis alone would have reshaped the spiritual development of humanity. Buddhism, which had already begun spreading from India to China, would have become the philosophical foundation of a unified empire that spanned both regions. But this wouldn't have been the Buddhism we know from history. This would have been a hybrid system that incorporated Confucian ethical principles, Hindu metaphysical concepts, Taoist practical wisdom, and indigenous Chinese spiritual traditions into something unprecedented. The monastic institutions that emerged from this synthesis would have been unlike anything that existed in either parent tradition. Buddhist monasteries that incorporated Confucian educational methods and Hindu philosophical debate techniques. Meditation practices that combined Indian yogic traditions with Chinese breathing exercises and martial arts. Scholarly communities that preserved and transmitted both Sanskrit and Chinese classical literature while developing entirely new forms of religious and philosophical expression. The impact on global religious development would have been staggering. The Islamic expansion that began in the 7th century would have encountered not fragmented Buddhist and Hindu communities, but a unified philosophical system that had already demonstrated its ability to synthesize different spiritual traditions while maintaining intellectual coherence. The religious wars that characterized medieval Europe and the Middle East might never have occurred, because the Indo-Chinese Empire would have provided a working model of religious pluralism and philosophical synthesis. The economic implications of this cultural fusion would have been equally transformative. The Gupta Empire had already developed sophisticated systems for managing trade across diverse ecological and cultural zones. Their commercial network stretched from the spice-producing regions of South India to the silk-weaving centers of Central Asia, coordinated through a monetary system that could handle transactions across vast distances and cultural differences. Chinese commercial innovations were equally advanced but focused on different challenges. Their understanding of manufacturing processes, quality control, and supply chain management was arguably the most sophisticated in the ancient world. Their innovations in banking, credit, and commercial law had created economic institutions that could support large-scale industrial production and long-distance trade. The fusion of these two commercial systems would have created the world's first truly global economy. Indian expertise in maritime trade and monsoon navigation, combined with Chinese innovations in land-based transportation and manufacturing. The result would have been commercial networks that could move goods efficiently from the factories of China to the markets of Europe, coordinated through a single administrative system that guaranteed quality, enforced contracts, and provided security across distances that other civilizations could barely imagine. The technological innovations that emerged from this economic integration would have accelerated human development by centuries. Chinese manufacturing techniques enhanced by Indian mathematical precision. Indian metallurgical innovations applied to Chinese industrial processes. The hybrid technologies that resulted would have been producing goods of a quality and sophistication that wouldn't appear elsewhere until the Industrial Revolution. But here's what makes this scenario truly mind-bending: the demographic implications of successful Indo-Chinese unification. The combined population of the Gupta Empire and the Chinese territories would have been somewhere around 60 to 80 million people, making it by far the largest political entity in the ancient world. But more than that, it would have been a population with access to the most advanced agricultural, medical, and technological innovations of the era. The agricultural productivity alone would have been revolutionary. Indian expertise in crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management combined with Chinese innovations in tool design, pest control, and food preservation. The unified empire would have been capable of supporting population densities that wouldn't be achieved elsewhere until the medieval period, with agricultural surpluses large enough to sustain massive urban populations and extensive military forces. The medical advances that resulted from combining Indian and Chinese healing traditions would have dramatically increased life expectancy and reduced infant mortality. Indian surgical techniques and pharmaceutical knowledge merged with Chinese understanding of anatomy and diagnostic methods. The hybrid medical system would have been treating diseases and performing procedures that European medicine wouldn't master until the Renaissance. The demographic growth that resulted from these innovations would have created human resources on a scale that no other ancient civilization could match. The unified Indo-Chinese empire would have had more people, better educated, healthier, and more technologically sophisticated than any potential rival. The military implications alone would have made the empire virtually unconquerable by any external force. But perhaps most importantly, this demographic advantage would have been distributed across the world's most extensive trade networks. Indo-Chinese merchants, administrators, and settlers would have been present in commercial centres from Rome to Southeast Asia, not as representatives of competing kingdoms, but as agents of a single unified system. The cultural influence of this empire would have spread far beyond its political boundaries, creating a zone of Indo-Chinese civilization that encompassed much of the known world. The long-term implications for human development are almost impossible to calculate. The technological, administrative, and cultural innovations that emerged from Indo-Chinese unification would have provided alternative models of social organization that could have influenced every other civilization of the ancient and medieval periods. The very concept of Western exceptionalism that drove European expansion and colonialism might never have developed, because Eastern traditions would have maintained their dominance through superior technology, more efficient administration, and more inclusive cultural synthesis. The scientific revolution, the age of exploration, the industrial revolution, all the developments that we associate with European ascendancy might have occurred centuries earlier in the unified Indo-Chinese empire. The trajectory of human progress that we take for granted, the assumption that technological and social development necessarily leads through European dominance to modern Western civilization, would have been revealed as just one possible path among many. This alternative timeline, based on a single decision that could have been made in the Gupta court during the crucial months of 320 CE, represents more than just military conquest or political unification. It represents a fundamentally different approach to human organization, one that prioritized synthesis over domination, cooperation over competition, cultural fusion over cultural replacement. The world that would have emerged from successful Indo-Chinese unification wouldn't have been a larger version of existing empires. It would have been something entirely new in human experience, a genuinely cosmopolitan civilization that drew its strength not from the dominance of a single tradition, but from the creative combination of multiple traditions into something greater than the sum of its parts. And as we stand here today, looking back across the centuries at the path not taken, we can only wonder what humanity might have achieved if that single decision had been made differently, if ambition had met opportunity in the royal court at Pataliputra, if the conquest that could have changed everything had actually occurred. The ripple effects of this alternative history would have extended far beyond military conquest or administrative efficiency. We're talking about a fundamental transformation in how human societies understood the relationship between power, knowledge, and cultural identity. The Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have just ruled territories, it would have pioneered entirely new concepts of what empire itself could mean. Consider the philosophical revolution that would have emerged from this synthesis. Indian traditions of metaphysical speculation, with their sophisticated understanding of consciousness, reality, and cosmic order, encountering Chinese practical wisdom about governance, ethics, and social harmony. The hybrid philosophical systems that developed wouldn't have been academic exercises confined to monastery schools or court scholars. They would have been living traditions that shaped how ordinary people understood their place in the universe. Picture a farmer in what had been Shandong province, working fields that were now irrigated using Gupta hydraulic techniques, but following agricultural practices that combined Chinese seasonal wisdom with Indian astronomical calculations. His daily routine would have been governed by a calendar system that integrated Chinese observational precision with Indian mathematical elegance. His understanding of why he planted certain crops at specific times would have drawn on both Taoist concepts of natural harmony and Hindu ideas about cosmic cycles. This wasn't just cultural mixing. This was the creation of entirely new ways of being human. The social psychology that emerged from Indo-Chinese fusion would have produced individuals who thought differently about fundamental questions like personal identity, social obligation, and spiritual development. These people wouldn't have been Chinese who happened to live under Indian rule, or Indians who happened to govern Chinese territories. They would have been something new, genuinely bicultural humans whose mental frameworks combined the insights of both traditions. The educational implications alone would have been revolutionary. Imagine schools in former Chinese territories where students learned to read Sanskrit alongside Chinese characters, where mathematical problems were solved using both Indian decimal notation and Chinese computational methods, where historical lessons drew examples from both the Ramayana and the records of the grand historian. These students wouldn't have been receiving a Chinese education with Indian supplements or an Indian curriculum with Chinese additions. They would have been developing intellectual capabilities that neither parent civilization could have produced alone. The psychological sophistication that resulted from this educational synthesis would have created human beings with cognitive abilities that were centuries ahead of their time. Students trained to think simultaneously in multiple philosophical frameworks, to solve problems using different mathematical systems, to analyze situations from both Indian and Chinese cultural perspectives. The intellectual flexibility and creative problem-solving capacity of these individuals would have been unprecedented in human history. But here's where this gets truly mind-bending. The technological acceleration that would have resulted from having an entire population trained in hybrid intellectual traditions. Innovation doesn't just come from individual genius, it emerges from the intersection of different knowledge systems. The Indo-Chinese Empire would have had millions of people whose daily work involved combining Indian and Chinese approaches to practical problems. Consider what would have happened to metallurgy, a field where both civilizations had already made remarkable advances. Indian expertise in steel production, including the famous Wootz steel that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries, meeting Chinese innovations in furnace design, alloy composition, and precision manufacturing. The hybrid metallurgical techniques that emerged wouldn't have been simple combinations of existing methods. They would have been entirely new approaches that solved problems neither civilization could have addressed alone. The weapons and tools produced by this technological fusion would have been centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. Indo-Chinese steel would have been harder, more flexible, and more precisely manufactured than any competing products. The military advantages alone would have made the empire's armies virtually invincible, but the civilian applications would have been equally transformative. Agricultural tools that could work harder soils more efficiently. Construction implements that allowed for more precise stone cutting and metal working. manufacturing equipment that could produce goods of unprecedented quality and consistency. The economic productivity that resulted from these technological advantages would have created wealth on a scale that the ancient world had never seen. But let's talk about something even more fascinating: the artistic renaissance that would have emerged from this cultural synthesis. Art doesn't just reflect existing traditions, it creates new possibilities for human expression. The hybrid artistic forms that developed in the Indo-Chinese Empire would have been unlike anything that existed in either parent civilization. Imagine sculptural traditions that combined Indian understanding of human anatomy and spiritual symbolism with Chinese mastery of landscape representation and environmental integration. Temple carvings that depicted Hindu and Buddhist deities using artistic techniques that had been perfected in Chinese workshops. Architectural decorations that integrated Sanskrit calligraphy with Chinese landscape painting. The aesthetic sophistication that resulted would have created art forms of unprecedented beauty and complexity. The musical traditions that emerged would have been equally revolutionary. Indian ragas, with their sophisticated understanding of emotional expression and spiritual development, encountering Chinese innovations in instrumental design and harmonic theory. The hybrid musical forms that developed wouldn't have been Indian melodies played on Chinese instruments, or Chinese compositions adapted to Indian scales. They would have been entirely new musical languages that could express emotional and spiritual experiences that neither tradition could have captured alone. The literary achievements would have been even more remarkable. Sanskrit poetry, with its complex metrical systems and philosophical depth, meeting Chinese traditions of historical narrative and social observation. The hybrid literary forms that emerged would have been capable of artistic achievements that were simultaneously more intellectually sophisticated than Chinese literature and more emotionally powerful than Sanskrit poetry. But perhaps most significantly, the religious and spiritual innovations that emerged from this synthesis would have fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of the divine and the sacred. The Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have just tolerated religious diversity, it would have created new forms of spiritual experience that transcended the limitations of individual traditions. Picture temple complexes that integrated Hindu iconographic programs with Buddhist philosophical teachings and Confucian ethical principles, meditation practices that combined Indian yogic techniques with Chinese breathing exercises and martial arts training, philosophical schools that synthesized Vedantic metaphysics with Taoist natural philosophy and Confucian social theory. The spiritual traditions that emerged from this synthesis wouldn't have been compromises between different religious systems. They would have been genuinely new approaches to understanding the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic reality. The monks and philosophers of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have been exploring questions about the nature of existence, the purpose of human life, and the structure of reality that other civilizations wouldn't even think to ask. The impact on global religious development would have been staggering. When Islamic expansion began in the 7th century, instead of encountering fragmented Buddhist and Hindu communities, Muslim armies would have faced a unified philosophical system that had already demonstrated its ability to synthesize different spiritual traditions while maintaining intellectual coherence. The religious synthesis that emerged from this encounter might have created forms of Islamic thought that were more philosophically sophisticated and more practically effective than anything that developed in our timeline. The long-term implications for human spiritual development are almost impossible to calculate. The religious wars that characterized medieval Europe and the Middle East might never have occurred because the Indo-Chinese Empire would have provided a working model of how different spiritual traditions could coexist and enrich each other rather than competing for dominance. But let's step back and consider the geopolitical implications of this alternative history, because the existence of a unified Indo-Chinese Empire would have fundamentally altered the strategic calculations of every other power in the ancient world. The Roman Empire, already struggling with economic crisis and barbarian invasions, would have faced a completely different international environment. Instead of profitable trade relationships with multiple Asian kingdoms, Rome would have confronted a single Indo-Chinese power that controlled all the luxury goods they desperately needed. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Central Asian gems, all would have flowed through a unified commercial system that could dictate terms to Roman merchants. The balance of trade that was already draining Roman gold eastward would have become even more unfavourable, accelerating the economic collapse that contributed to the fall of the Western Empire. But more than that, the technological and administrative innovations of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have provided alternative models of governance that could have influenced Roman political development. Roman administrators, struggling with the challenges of governing a multi-ethnic empire across vast distances, would have been forced to study Indo-Chinese methods of federal administration and cultural integration. The military implications would have been equally significant. Roman armies, already stretched thin across multiple frontiers, would have faced the possibility of Indo-Chinese military intervention in regions where Roman and Indo-Chinese spheres of influence overlapped. The Sassanid Empire, caught between Roman pressure from the west and Indo-Chinese expansion from the east, might have sought alliance with one power against the other, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in the Middle East. The nomadic confederations of Central Asia, who in our timeline eventually conquered both Indian and Chinese territories, would have found themselves facing a unified empire with the resources and military sophistication to push them back into the steppes permanently. The Hun invasions that terrorized Europe might never have occurred because the Huns themselves would have been contained or absorbed by Indo-Chinese frontier forces. This containment of nomadic expansion would have had cascading effects throughout the ancient world. The Visigothic invasions of the Roman Empire, the Vandal conquest of North Africa, the Saxon settlement of Britain, all of these population movements were part of a domino effect that began with nomadic pressure on the frontiers of settled civilizations. If that pressure had been contained by Indo-Chinese military power, the entire pattern of late antique migration and conquest might have been different. The Islamic expansion that began in the 7th century would have encountered a completely different geopolitical landscape. Instead of conquering fragmented Persian and Byzantine territories, Islamic armies would have faced a unified Hindu-Buddhist empire that controlled territory from the Arabian Sea to the Pacific Ocean. The religious and cultural synthesis that emerged from Islamic conquest might never have occurred, because the balance of power would have remained firmly tilted toward Eastern philosophical and political traditions. But here's what makes this scenario truly fascinating from a world historical perspective. The technological and scientific advantages of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have created a situation where Eastern traditions maintained their dominance well into what we call the medieval period. The scientific revolution that occurred in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries might have happened in India or China during the 8th or 9th centuries. The printing revolution alone would have had staggering implications. Chinese innovations in paper-making and printing technology, enhanced by Indian traditions of scholarly debate and mathematical notation, would have created an information revolution centuries before Gutenberg. Scientific treatises, mathematical innovations, and technical manuals could have been distributed throughout the empire within months rather than decades. The educational implications would have been equally transformative. Instead of knowledge being confined to small groups of scholars in monastery schools or court academies, the Indo-Chinese Empire would have had the technological capability to create mass literacy and broad-based education. The human capital development that resulted would have accelerated innovation across every field of knowledge. The navigational and maritime technologies that emerged from combining Indian oceanic expertise with Chinese shipbuilding innovations would have made possible voyages of exploration that other civilizations couldn't even imagine. Indo-Chinese expeditions might have reached the Americas centuries before Columbus, established trade relationships with Australian Aboriginal societies, or explored the African coast from both the Indian Ocean and Atlantic sides. The implications for global development are almost impossible to calculate. The demographic catastrophe that befell Native American populations through exposure to Old World diseases would still have occurred, but within the context of a more sophisticated and less exploitative contact situation. The technological and agricultural innovations that the Indo-Chinese Empire developed through centuries of managing diverse populations across vast territories would have been applied to American conditions, potentially accelerating indigenous technological development rather than destroying indigenous societies. The age of exploration that led to European colonialism might have been led by Indo-Chinese navigators who brought different cultural values and different approaches to cross-cultural contact. Instead of conquest and exploitation, we might have seen the establishment of trading networks and cultural exchange systems that preserved indigenous autonomy while facilitating technological and agricultural transfer. The Industrial Revolution itself might have begun with Indian innovations and Chinese workshops, powered by the vast resources and unified markets of the world's largest empire. The trajectory of technological development that we associate with European exceptionalism could have been an Eastern phenomenon, driven by the intellectual and material resources of a civilization that combined the best of both Indian and Chinese traditions. But perhaps most importantly, the very concept of East versus West that has shaped global politics for the past several centuries might never have developed. The Indo-Chinese Empire would have created a unified Eastern civilization that stretched from the Indian Ocean to the Pacific, with sufficient military, economic and technological power to maintain its independence and cultural integrity against any external challenge. The philosophical and religious synthesis that emerged from this unification would have provided alternative models of social organization that emphasized cooperation over competition, cultural fusion over cultural replacement, and synthesis over domination. These models might have influenced the development of every other civilization they encountered, creating a world where conflict was resolved through negotiation and cultural exchange rather than conquest and subordination. The world that would have emerged from successful Indo-Chinese unification wouldn't have been just a larger version of existing empires. It would have been something entirely new in human experience, a genuinely cosmopolitan civilization that drew its strength not from the dominance of a single tradition, but from the creative combination of multiple traditions into something greater than the sum of its parts. And as we contemplate this alternative timeline, we're forced to confront a fundamental question about the nature of historical development itself. Was the European dominance that characterized the modern period an inevitable result of superior technology and social organization, or was it simply one possible outcome among many? The Indo-Chinese Empire that could have emerged from Gupta conquest of China suggests that history might have taken a completely different path, one that led not to Western hegemony but to Eastern synthesis, not to cultural conflict but to civilizational fusion. The decision that could have created this alternative world hung in the balance during those crucial months of 320 CE, when Chandragupta II stood at the pinnacle of Gupta power and Chinese civilization lay fractured and vulnerable. The conquest that would have changed everything was not just militarily possible, it was historically probable under the right circumstances. And those circumstances existed, waiting for a single moment of visionary ambition to transform them into reality. The world we inhabit today, with its particular patterns of cultural dominance and technological development, its specific forms of international conflict and cooperation, its unique trajectory from ancient empire to modern nation-state, all of this might have been completely different if that moment had been seized, if that decision had been made, if the conquest that could have changed everything had actually occurred. The psychological impact on the peoples of both regions would have been profound beyond anything we can imagine today. We're not just talking about political conquest or administrative change. We're talking about a fundamental transformation in how entire populations understood their place in the world, their relationship to authority, and their connection to the cosmic order itself. Picture a Chinese scholar in Chang'an, someone who had spent decades mastering Confucian classics and serving in the imperial bureaucracy, suddenly finding himself under the rule of Indian administrators who spoke of dharma and karma instead of li and ren. His initial reaction might have been confusion, even resistance. But as months passed and he witnessed the efficiency of Gupta administration, the fairness of their legal procedures, and their genuine respect for Chinese intellectual traditions, something remarkable would have begun to happen. This scholar wouldn't have simply submitted to foreign rule. He would have started to see possibilities that his own fractured political system had never offered. The Gupta concept of righteous governance, where rulers were bound by cosmic law to serve their subjects' welfare, would have resonated with his Confucian training about benevolent government. The Indian mathematical systems he encountered would have solved computational problems that Chinese methods struggled with. The Sanskrit philosophical texts he began studying would have opened intellectual vistas that purely Chinese scholarship couldn't reach. Within a generation, this scholar's children would have been genuinely bicultural, as comfortable debating Vedantic philosophy as analysing the spring and autumn annals. They wouldn't have seen themselves as Chinese people under Indian rule, but as citizens of a new kind of civilization that transcended those old categories entirely. But here's what makes this transformation absolutely fascinating. It wouldn't have been a one-way process. The Indian administrators and settlers who established themselves in Chinese territories would have undergone an equally profound change. A Gupta governor arriving in Luoyang with his retinue of Sanskrit-trained bureaucrats would have quickly discovered that effective governance required understanding Chinese social customs, agricultural practices, and local religious observances. The hybrid administrative culture that emerged wouldn't have been Indian officials imposing their methods on Chinese subjects. It would have been a genuinely collaborative system, where both traditions contributed their strengths to create something superior to either alone. Chinese precision in record-keeping enhanced by Indian sophistication in managing diverse populations. Indian flexibility in legal interpretation guided by Chinese systematic approach to procedural justice. The children of these Indian administrators, growing up in Chinese cities, attending schools where they learned both Sanskrit and Chinese, participating in festivals that combined Hindu rituals with Confucian ceremonies, would have developed cultural identities that were unprecedented in human history. They would have been the world's first truly cosmopolitan generation, equally at home in temples and academies, comfortable with both Sanskrit poetry and Chinese historical writing, capable of thinking simultaneously in multiple philosophical frameworks. Now imagine the cumulative effect of this transformation occurring across millions of people over several generations. We're talking about the emergence of an entirely new kind of human consciousness, one that wasn't limited by the cultural boundaries that had previously defined civilizational identity. These people wouldn't have thought of themselves as Indian or Chinese first. They would have identified primarily with the hybrid civilization they were creating together. The psychological resilience of this population would have been extraordinary. People trained from childhood to think in multiple cultural frameworks, to solve problems using different intellectual traditions, to find meaning through various spiritual practices, would have been remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The mental flexibility and creative problem-solving capacity of the Indo-Chinese population would have given their civilization enormous advantages in responding to challenges that would have overwhelmed more culturally homogeneous societies. But let's talk about something that would have blown the minds of contemporary observers: the marriage customs and family structures that emerge from this cultural fusion. Indian concepts of dharmic duty and cosmic order, meeting Chinese ideas about filial piety and ancestral veneration. The hybrid family systems that developed wouldn't have been Indian joint families with Chinese characteristics, or Chinese nuclear families following Indian practices. They would have been entirely new forms of kinship organization that solved problems neither parent system could handle alone. Picture a wedding ceremony in this unified empire, perhaps between a woman from a traditional Chinese merchant family and a man whose ancestors had come with the original Gupta conquest. The ritual wouldn't have been purely Hindu or purely Chinese. It would have been a synthesis that honoured both traditions while creating something new. Sanskrit mantras alternating with Chinese ceremonial music, Hindu fire rituals combined with Chinese tea ceremonies, Confucian vows about social harmony integrated with Vedic prayers for cosmic blessing. The children of such unions would have grown up in households where multiple languages were spoken naturally, where different religious traditions were practiced simultaneously, where various philosophical systems were applied to daily decisions. These children would have developed cognitive abilities that were centuries ahead of their time, brains literally rewired by multicultural experience to process information and solve problems in ways that single-culture populations couldn't match. The educational implications of this psychological transformation would have been staggering. Schools in the Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have been teaching Chinese students Indian subjects or Indian students Chinese curriculum. They would have been developing entirely new pedagogical methods designed to cultivate genuinely bicultural intelligence. Students would have learned to read Sanskrit and Chinese simultaneously, to solve mathematical problems using multiple computational systems, to analyze historical events from both Indian and Chinese perspectives. The intellectual capabilities that emerged from this educational synthesis would have accelerated innovation across every field of knowledge. Students trained to think in multiple philosophical frameworks would have been identifying connections and possibilities that escaped scholars working within single traditions. The scientific and technological breakthroughs that resulted would have pushed human knowledge centuries ahead of where it stood in other civilizations. But here's where this gets truly mind-bending. The spiritual and psychological effects of this cultural fusion would have created new forms of human consciousness that were fundamentally different from anything that existed in either parent civilization. We're talking about people whose sense of identity, whose understanding of reality, whose relationship to the divine, were shaped by traditions that had never been combined before in human history. The meditation practices that emerged from this synthesis would have been unlike anything that existed in either Indian or Chinese traditions alone. Buddhist mindfulness techniques enhanced by Taoist breathing exercises, Hindu yogic practices integrated with Confucian ethical reflection. The hybrid contemplative traditions that developed would have been producing altered states of consciousness and spiritual insights that neither parent tradition could have achieved independently. The philosophical schools that emerged would have been grappling with questions about the nature of existence, the purpose of human life, and the structure of reality that were literally unthinkable within single cultural frameworks. Vedantic metaphysics applied to Taoist natural philosophy, Confucian social theory informed by Hindu concepts of cosmic law. The intellectual achievements of these hybrid philosophical traditions would have been centuries ahead of anything that developed in our timeline. The artistic expressions that emerge from this psychological transformation would have been equally revolutionary. We're not just talking about Indian techniques applied to Chinese subjects or Chinese methods used for Indian themes. We're talking about entirely new aesthetic languages that could express experiences and emotions that were literally impossible within single cultural traditions. Imagine poetry that combined Sanskrit prosodic sophistication with Chinese tonal subtlety. Paintings that integrated Indian symbolic complexity with Chinese landscape mastery. Musical compositions that synthesized Indian raga systems with Chinese instrumental innovation. The artistic achievements of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have created beauty that was simultaneously more intellectually sophisticated and more emotionally powerful than anything either parent civilization could have produced alone. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological effects of this cultural fusion would have created forms of leadership and governance that were unprecedented in human history. The rulers and administrators of the Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have been Indians governing Chinese subjects or Chinese officials serving Indian masters. They would have been genuinely bicultural leaders whose decision-making processes drew simultaneously on both traditions. Picture Chandragupta Tadu in his later years, after decades of governing the unified empire. His thinking wouldn't have been purely Indian anymore. It would have been shaped by Chinese concepts of administrative efficiency, Confucian ideas about social harmony, Taoist principles of natural balance. When he faced a crisis, whether military, economic, or social, he would have been able to draw on intellectual resources that no single culture ruler could match. The governmental innovations that emerged from this hybrid leadership would have solved problems of large-scale administration that wouldn't be addressed elsewhere until the modern period. Federal systems that balanced local autonomy with central coordination. Legal frameworks that combined the philosophical depth of dharmic principles with the practical precision of Chinese procedural law. Economic policies that integrated Indian commercial sophistication with Chinese manufacturing expertise. The military leadership that emerged would have been equally revolutionary. Generals who understood both Indian psychological warfare techniques and Chinese strategic planning methods. Officers trained in both elephant tactics and siege engineering. Soldiers whose combat effectiveness was enhanced by martial arts traditions that combined Indian yogic body control with Chinese weapons mastery. The long-term implications of these psychological and cultural transformations are almost impossible to calculate. The Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have just been larger or more powerful than other ancient civilizations. It would have been populated by human beings whose cognitive abilities, creative capacities, and problem-solving skills were fundamentally superior to anything that existed elsewhere. When this empire encountered other civilizations, whether through trade, diplomacy, or military contact, the intellectual and cultural advantages of its bicultural population would have been immediately apparent. Roman merchants dealing with Indo-Chinese traders would have found themselves outmaneuvered by people who could think strategically in ways that single-culture minds couldn't match. Persian diplomats negotiating with Indo-Chinese ambassadors would have discovered that their counterparts could identify solutions and possibilities that escaped purely Persian analysis. The technological innovations that emerged from this superior human capital would have maintained the empire's dominance for centuries. Each generation of Indo-Chinese citizens would have been more intellectually sophisticated than the last. As hybrid cultural traditions became more refined and educational methods became more effective, the cumulative effect would have been a civilization that pulled further and further ahead of its competitors in every field of human endeavor. The religious and spiritual implications would have been equally transformative. The hybrid contemplative traditions of the Indo-Chinese Empire would have been producing saints, sages, and enlightened beings whose spiritual achievements transcended anything possible within single religious frameworks. These figures would have attracted followers from across the ancient world, spreading Indo-Chinese philosophical and spiritual innovations far beyond the empire's political boundaries. The very concept of religious conflict that characterized so much of later history might never have developed, because the Indo-Chinese Empire would have demonstrated that different spiritual traditions could not only coexist, but actually enhance each other through synthesis. The religious wars that devastated Europe and the Middle East during the medieval period would have been unthinkable in a world where the dominant civilization had already solved the problem of religious diversity through integration rather than competition. But here's what makes this alternative timeline truly staggering in its implications. The psychological and cultural transformations we're describing wouldn't have been limited to the Indo-Chinese Empire itself. The superior human capital, the more effective social organization, the more sophisticated technologies would have influenced every civilization that came into contact with them. The Roman Empire, struggling with barbarian invasions and internal decay, would have been forced to study Indo-Chinese methods of cultural integration and administrative efficiency. The nomadic confederations of Central Asia would have encountered a unified civilization whose psychological and military advantages made conquest impossible. The emerging Islamic world would have faced an Eastern power whose philosophical sophistication and spiritual achievements challenged any claim to religious superiority. Over time, the entire trajectory of human development would have been altered. The scientific revolution that occurred in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries might have happened in the Indo-Chinese Empire during the 8th or 9th centuries, driven by human beings whose bicultural training gave them cognitive advantages that European scholars couldn't match. The age of exploration might have been led by Indo-Chinese navigators, whose superior mathematical and astronomical knowledge made possible voyages that other civilizations couldn't attempt. The Industrial Revolution itself might have begun in workshops where Indian mathematical innovations were applied to Chinese manufacturing techniques by workers whose hybrid cultural training made them more innovative and adaptable than any single culture population. The entire pattern of technological development that we associate with European dominance could have been an Eastern phenomenon driven by the superior human capital of a civilization that had learned to combine the best of multiple traditions. And as we contemplate this alternative timeline, we're forced to confront a profound truth about the nature of human potential itself. The cognitive abilities, creative capacities, and problem-solving skills that we consider normal are actually the products of specific cultural limitations. Human beings raised within single cultural traditions, however sophisticated those traditions might be, are operating with only a fraction of their potential, intellectual and creative capabilities. The Indo-Chinese Empire that could have emerged from Gupta conquest of China would have demonstrated what human beings are actually capable of when cultural boundaries are transcended rather than reinforced. The psychological and intellectual achievements of its bicultural population would have revealed possibilities for human development that we can barely imagine today. This wasn't just an alternative political or military history. This was an alternative trajectory for human consciousness itself, a path toward forms of intelligence and creativity that would have accelerated our species' development by centuries. The decision that could have created this transformation hung in the balance during those crucial months of 320 CE, when a single choice in the Gupta court could have unleashed human potential on a scale that would have changed the entire course of our civilization. The conquest that would have changed everything was not just about territorial expansion or political unification. It was about the liberation of human consciousness from the artificial constraints of cultural separation, the creation of a new kind of human being whose psychological and intellectual capabilities transcended anything that had existed before in our species' history. And that transformation, that revolutionary expansion of human potential, was waiting to be born in a moment when ambition met opportunity, when military genius encountered political chaos, when the greatest decision in human history was poised to be made. The economic transformation alone would have been breathtaking in its scope and complexity. Picture the moment when Gupta administrators first laid eyes on Chinese manufacturing centers, their workshops humming with innovations that had taken centuries to perfect. The silk production facilities of the Yangtze River Valley, with their sophisticated reeling techniques and quality control systems that could produce fabrics of unprecedented uniformity. The iron foundries of Henan province, where Chinese metallurgists had developed blast furnace technologies that could achieve temperatures and production volumes unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. But here's what makes this economic fusion absolutely electrifying. The Guptas weren't just conquering Chinese territories, They were inheriting the most advanced manufacturing base that existed anywhere on Earth at that time. Chinese workshops that had been producing goods for local and regional markets would suddenly have access to Indian Ocean trade networks that stretched from the Red Sea to Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, Indian craftsmen who had perfected techniques for working with tropical materials would gain access to Chinese innovations in precision tooling and mass production. The hybrid manufacturing systems that emerged wouldn't have been Indian techniques applied to Chinese materials or Chinese methods used for Indian products. They would have been entirely new approaches to production that solved problems neither civilization could have addressed alone. Indian expertise in working with organic materials like cotton, silk, and precious woods, enhanced by Chinese mastery of mechanical precision and standardized processes. Chinese innovations in metalworking and ceramic production, guided by Indian understanding of chemical processes and material science. The quality of goods produced by these hybrid workshops would have been centuries ahead of anything else in the ancient world. Textiles that combined Indian dyeing techniques with Chinese weaving innovations, creating fabrics of unprecedented beauty and durability. Metalwork that merged Indian expertise in alloy composition with Chinese precision in shaping and finishing. Ceramic products that integrated Chinese throwing techniques with Indian glazing methods, producing pottery that was simultaneously more functional and more aesthetically sophisticated than anything either tradition could create independently. But let's talk about something that would have absolutely revolutionized ancient commerce. The standardization systems that would have emerged from this economic integration. The Guptas had already developed sophisticated methods for ensuring quality and consistency across their existing trade networks. Their gold coins were accepted from Central Asia to Southeast Asia because merchants knew they could rely on consistent weight and purity standards. Their measurement systems allowed for precise transactions across vast distances and cultural differences. Chinese manufacturing, meanwhile, had achieved levels of standardization that wouldn't be matched elsewhere for centuries. Their production techniques could create thousands of identical items, whether ceramic vessels, metal tools, or textile products. Their quality control procedures ensured that goods met specific standards regardless of which workshop produced them. The fusion of these two standardization systems would have created the world's first truly global manufacturing network. Imagine a merchant ordering silk textiles in Pataliputra, knowing that the products delivered 6 months later would meet exactly the same specifications, whether they were produced in workshops near Chang'an or facilities along the Yangtze River. The reduction in transaction costs and commercial uncertainty would have accelerated trade to levels that the ancient world had never seen. The monetary implications alone would have been staggering. The Gupta gold standard, already the most stable currency system in South Asia, would have been backed by the productive capacity of Chinese manufacturing centres. The economic power that resulted from combining Indian precious metal resources with Chinese industrial output would have created a monetary system of unprecedented strength and stability. Picture the psychological impact on merchants throughout the ancient world when they realized that Indo-Chinese commercial networks offered not just access to luxury goods, but guarantee of quality, reliability of delivery, and stability of pricing that no other system could match. Roman traders who had previously dealt with dozens of different suppliers across fragmented Asian markets would suddenly find themselves negotiating with representatives of a unified commercial system that could provide everything they needed through a single set of procedures. The competitive advantages would have been overwhelming. While Roman merchants were still coordinating complex transactions between multiple Chinese kingdoms, Persian middlemen, and Central Asian tribal leaders, Indo-Chinese traders would have been operating within an integrated system where a single contract could guarantee delivery of goods produced anywhere across the world's largest manufacturing network. But here's where this economic transformation becomes truly mind-bending. The technological acceleration that would have resulted from combining Indian and Chinese approaches to innovation and development. Chinese manufacturing had already achieved remarkable sophistication through systematic improvement of production techniques over centuries. Their innovations in everything from papermaking to mechanical engineering reflected a cultural commitment to practical problem-solving and incremental refinement. Indian technological development, by contrast, had been driven by different priorities: mathematical precision, theoretical sophistication, and integration with philosophical and spiritual principles. Indian innovations in metallurgy, for instance, weren't just about producing better tools and weapons. They were about understanding the fundamental properties of materials and how those properties related to cosmic principles and natural laws. The hybrid technological culture that emerged from combining these approaches would have been unlike anything that existed anywhere else in the ancient world. Chinese practical problem-solving enhanced by Indian theoretical sophistication. Indian mathematical precision applied to Chinese engineering challenges. The result wouldn't have been gradual improvement of existing technologies, but revolutionary breakthroughs that leaped ahead of anything that single culture innovation could achieve. Consider what would have happened to transportation technology, a field where both civilizations had already made significant advances. Chinese innovations in road construction, bridge building, and vehicle design meeting Indian expertise in navigation, logistics, and long-distance coordination. The transportation networks that emerged would have been capable of moving goods and people across the unified empire with efficiency that wouldn't be matched elsewhere until the modern period. The communication systems required to coordinate this vast economic network would have been equally revolutionary. Chinese innovations in message encryption and record-keeping, combined with Indian mathematical techniques for data analysis and information processing. The administrative technologies that resulted would have been capable of managing commercial transactions, inventory tracking, and quality control across distances and cultural differences that would have overwhelmed any other ancient system. But let's examine something that would have had profound implications for global development: the agricultural revolution that would have resulted from combining Indian and Chinese farming techniques. Chinese agriculture had already achieved remarkable productivity through innovations in crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management. Their understanding of seasonal patterns, pest control, and food preservation was arguably the most advanced in the ancient world. Indian agriculture brought different strengths: sophisticated understanding of monsoon patterns, expertise in managing diverse ecological zones, and mathematical precision in calculating optimal planting and harvesting schedules. Indian farmers had also developed remarkable techniques for working with tropical crops and managing agricultural systems that could function effectively across widely varying climatic conditions. The hybrid agricultural systems that emerged from combining these approaches would have been capable of supporting population densities that were unprecedented in the ancient world. Crop yields that integrated Chinese systematic methods with Indian mathematical precision. Irrigation systems that combined Chinese engineering expertise with Indian understanding of water management across diverse terrains. Food preservation and distribution networks that could maintain nutritional quality across the vast distances of the unified empire. The demographic implications would have been staggering. The unified Indo-Chinese Empire would have been capable of supporting a population that was not only larger than any other ancient civilization, but also better fed, healthier, and more economically productive. The human resources available for military service, manufacturing production, and intellectual development would have given the empire overwhelming advantages over any potential rivals. But here's what makes this agricultural revolution absolutely fascinating from a world historical perspective: the surplus production that would have resulted from these hybrid farming techniques. Ancient civilizations were typically limited by the agricultural productivity of their core territories. Even the most successful empires could only expand to the extent that their agricultural base could support additional population and military forces. The Indo-Chinese Empire would have broken through these traditional limitations entirely. The agricultural productivity that resulted from combining Indian and Chinese techniques would have generated surpluses large enough to support massive urban populations, extensive military forces, and substantial numbers of people engaged in non-agricultural activities like manufacturing, scholarship, and artistic production. The economic specialization that became possible with this agricultural foundation would have accelerated development across every field of human activity. Cities that could support hundreds of thousands of people engaged in manufacturing, trade, administration, and intellectual pursuits. Military forces that could be maintained at levels that made the empire virtually invulnerable to external attack. Scholarly communities that could dedicate themselves to full-time research and innovation without concern for basic subsistence. The technological and cultural achievements that emerged from this economic foundation would have maintained the empire's dominance for centuries. Each generation would have built upon the innovations of the previous one, creating a cumulative effect that pulled the Indo-Chinese civilization further and further ahead of its competitors in every field of human endeavor. Now picture the moment when news of this economic transformation reached the courts of Rome, Ctesiphon, and Constantinople. Imagine the shock of Roman senators when they realized that their traditional sources of Asian luxury goods were now controlled by a single power that could dictate terms of trade. The psychological impact of discovering that the fragmented Chinese kingdoms they had grown accustomed to dealing with had been unified under Indian leadership, creating an economic power that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered. The strategic implications would have been immediate and profound. Roman gold, already flowing eastward in enormous quantities to pay for Asian luxury goods, would have been flowing into the treasuries of a unified power that could use those resources to finance military expansion, technological development, and further economic growth. The balance of economic power between East and West would have tilted so dramatically in favour of the Indo-Chinese Empire that Roman independence itself might have been threatened. Persian administrators, caught between Roman pressure from the West and this new Indo-Chinese superpower from the East, would have faced impossible strategic choices. Alliance with either power would have meant subordination to economic and military forces that the Sassanid Empire couldn't hope to match independently. The traditional balance of power that had allowed Persian independence would have been shattered by the emergence of an Eastern power that controlled resources and capabilities on an unprecedented scale. The nomadic confederations of Central Asia would have found their traditional economic strategies completely disrupted. The fragmented Chinese kingdoms that had previously provided opportunities for raiding, tribute extraction, and political manipulation would have been replaced by a unified military power, with the resources and organizational capability to push nomadic tribes back into the steppes permanently. The great migrations that historically brought nomadic peoples into contact with settled civilizations might have been contained or redirected entirely. But here's where this economic transformation would have had its most profound impact: the long-term trajectory of global development that would have resulted from Eastern economic dominance. The technological innovations, manufacturing techniques, and commercial practices developed by the Indo-Chinese Empire would have spread throughout the ancient world through trade relationships, diplomatic contacts, and cultural exchanges. The scientific revolution that occurred in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries might have happened in India or China during the 8th or 9th centuries, driven by the economic resources and intellectual freedom that the unified empire could provide to its scholars and inventors. The age of exploration that led to European discovery of the Americas might have been undertaken by Indo-Chinese expeditions, equipped with superior navigational technology and backed by the economic resources of the world's largest empire. The Industrial Revolution itself might have begun in workshops where Indian mathematical innovations were applied to Chinese manufacturing techniques, powered by the vast markets and abundant resources of a unified Asian economy. The entire pattern of technological development that we associate with European dominance could have been an Eastern phenomenon, driven by economic advantages that no Western power could hope to match. The implications for global development are almost impossible to calculate. Instead of European colonialism reshaping the world through superior military technology and economic organization, we might have seen Indo-Chinese expansion driven by even more advanced capabilities and guided by different cultural values. The demographic catastrophes, cultural destructions, and economic exploitations that characterized European colonial expansion might have been replaced by more sophisticated approaches to cross-cultural contact and economic development. The world that would have emerged from this alternative economic trajectory wouldn't have been just different in its political arrangements or cultural characteristics. It would have been fundamentally more advanced in its technological capabilities, more sophisticated in its economic organization, and more successful in its approaches to managing large-scale human societies across diverse geographical and cultural conditions. And all of this economic transformation, this revolutionary advancement in human organizational capability, this alternative trajectory for global development, hung in the balance during those crucial months of 320 CE, when a single decision in the Gupta court could have unleashed economic forces that would have reshaped the entire course of human civilization. The conquest that would have changed everything wasn't just about military victory or political unification. It was about economic revolution on a scale that would have accelerated human development by centuries, creating prosperity, technological advancement, and organizational sophistication that wouldn't be matched in our timeline until the modern industrial age. The decision that could have created this economic miracle was waiting to be made, poised on the edge of possibility, ready to transform not just the ancient world, but the entire future trajectory of human civilization. But as we stand here today, contemplating this extraordinary alternative timeline, we must confront the ultimate question. What would this world have looked like if it had actually come to pass? The Indo-Chinese Empire we've explored wasn't just a military or political possibility. It was a civilizational revolution waiting to happen. Every element was in place, every condition was met, every opportunity was present for this transformation to occur. Picture yourself walking through the capital of this unified empire in the year 400 CE. Perhaps a magnificent new city built at the confluence of great rivers, where Indian architectural principles merged with Chinese urban planning to create something unprecedented in human history. The streets would have been laid out according to mathematical principles that combined Sanskrit geometric theory with Chinese feng shui concepts. The buildings would have risen in styles that integrated Hindu temple architecture with Chinese pagoda design, creating vertical landscapes that seemed to touch the heavens while remaining rooted in earthly harmony. The markets would have been alive with voices speaking dozens of languages, but all conducting business according to standardized procedures that worked seamlessly, whether you were trading Malabar pepper for Sichuan silk or negotiating contracts for gunda and sculptures to be shipped to workshops in Luoyang. The currency would have been accepted from the Red Sea to the South China Sea, backed by the productive capacity of the world's most advanced manufacturing centres and guaranteed by the administrative efficiency of the world's most sophisticated governmental system. But here's what would have truly taken your breath away: the people themselves. These wouldn't have been Indians ruling over Chinese subjects or Chinese officials serving Indian masters. These would have been genuinely new human beings, the world's first truly cosmopolitan civilization, comfortable with philosophical concepts that drew from multiple traditions, capable of solving problems using intellectual frameworks that neither parent culture could have developed alone. The children playing in those streets would have been learning to read Sanskrit and Chinese characters simultaneously, their young minds developing cognitive abilities that were literally centuries ahead of their time. The scholars debating in the academies would have been grappling with questions about mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that combined the deepest insights of both civilizations. The artisans working in the workshops would have been creating goods of a quality and sophistication that wouldn't appear anywhere else in the world for another 1,000 years. The military forces protecting this empire would have been unlike anything that had ever existed. War elephants equipped with Chinese-engineered armour and weapons, operating alongside cavalry units that combined Indian psychological warfare techniques with Chinese strategic planning methods, siege engines that merged Indian mechanical innovations with Chinese precision manufacturing, intelligence networks that used both Indian psychological manipulation and Chinese systematic information gathering to maintain awareness of threats across distances that other civilizations could barely imagine. But perhaps most remarkably, this wouldn't have been a static achievement, a moment of greatness that gradually declined over time. The hybrid cultural, technological and economic systems we've explored would have been inherently dynamic, capable of continuous innovation and adaptation. Each generation would have built upon the achievements of the previous one, creating a cumulative effect that would have pulled this civilization further and further ahead of any potential competitors. The scientific advances alone would have been staggering. By 500 CE, Indo-Chinese astronomers might have been using mathematical models that wouldn't appear in European science until the Renaissance. Their medical practitioners might have been performing surgical procedures and treating diseases that European medicine wouldn't master until the 18th century. Their engineers might have been building machines and structures that combined Indian theoretical sophistication with Chinese practical precision to create technologies that seemed almost magical to outside observers. The navigational capabilities that would have emerged from this technological synthesis could have led to voyages of exploration that would have changed the entire pattern of global development. Indo-Chinese expeditions reaching the Americas in the 7th or 8th centuries, equipped with astronomical instruments and mathematical knowledge that made possible accurate navigation over oceanic distances. The contact between Old World and New World civilizations might have occurred under completely different circumstances, driven by trade and cultural exchange rather than conquest and exploitation. The religious and philosophical synthesis that would have characterized this empire might have provided alternative approaches to spiritual development that could have influenced the entire course of human religious evolution. Instead of the religious wars that devastated Europe and the Middle East during the medieval period, we might have seen the spread of hybrid spiritual traditions that demonstrated how different approaches to the divine could enhance, rather than conflict with each other, The economic power of this unified empire would have created global trade networks that operated according to principles of mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. Instead of the colonial exploitation that characterized European expansion, we might have seen Indo-Chinese commercial relationships that strengthened local economies while integrating them into broader networks of exchange and development. But here's what makes this alternative timeline truly profound in its implications. The psychological and cultural effects of this civilizational synthesis would have created new forms of human consciousness that were fundamentally different from anything that existed in our historical timeline. The people of the Indo-Chinese Empire wouldn't have thought about identity, community, spirituality, or knowledge in the same ways that characterized other ancient civilizations. Their approach to conflict resolution would have emphasized synthesis over domination. Their methods of technological development would have prioritized integration over competition. Their understanding of cultural difference would have focused on creative combination rather than hierarchical ranking. The very concepts of East versus West, religious warfare and cultural supremacy that have shaped so much of subsequent history might never have developed because this civilization would have demonstrated superior alternatives. And as we contemplate what we've lost by not having this alternative timeline, we're forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about the path that history actually took. The European dominance that characterized the modern period, the colonial exploitation that reshaped global demographics and economics, the religious conflicts that continue to influence international relations, the technological developments that occurred within competitive rather than collaborative frameworks, all of these patterns might have been avoided if that single decision had been made differently in 320 CE. The world we inhabit today, with its particular forms of international conflict, its specific patterns of technological development, its unique approaches to cultural difference and religious diversity, represents just one possible trajectory among many. The Indo-Chinese Empire that could have emerged from Gupta conquest of China suggests that human civilization could have developed along completely different lines, achieving higher levels of technological sophistication, cultural integration, and social harmony centuries earlier than actually occurred. The decision that could have created this alternative world was not just possible, it was probable under the right circumstances. Chandragupta possessed the military capability, administrative expertise, and economic resources necessary to achieve the conquest of China. The Chinese kingdoms of the 4th century were fractured, weakened, and vulnerable to exactly the kind of sophisticated military and political campaign that the Guptas had perfected through their Western conquests. The opportunity was there, gleaming like a jewel in the crown of possibility, waiting for a moment of visionary ambition to transform it into reality. The technological prerequisites existed. The cultural foundations were in place. The economic incentives were overwhelming. All that was needed was the decision to look beyond traditional boundaries and recognize that the ultimate prize lay not in further consolidation of existing territories, but in the unification of the world's 2 most advanced civilizations under Indian leadership. That decision, made in a moment of historical possibility, could have changed not just the political map of the ancient world, but the entire trajectory of human development. The conquest that would have changed everything was poised on the edge of reality, ready to unleash forces that would have accelerated our species' progress by centuries and created forms of human organization that we can barely imagine today. And as we close this extraordinary journey through the paths not taken, we're left with a profound sense of what might have been. The Indo-Chinese Empire that could have emerged from this conquest wouldn't have been just another ancient kingdom or dynasty. It would have been something entirely new in human experience, a genuinely cosmopolitan civilization that demonstrated humanity's potential for synthesis, cooperation, and creative combination of different traditions into something greater than the sum of its parts. The world that would have emerged from this alternative timeline might have been more peaceful, more prosperous, more technologically advanced, and more spiritually sophisticated than anything we've actually achieved. The very fact that such possibilities existed in the past suggests that similar opportunities might exist in our present, waiting for moments of vision and courage to transform them into reality. The shadows of history whisper across the centuries, carrying with them the weight of a single moment that could have reshaped everything we know about human civilization. As we reach the end of this extraordinary journey through the corridors of possibility, we're left standing at the crossroads of destiny itself, where one decision in an ancient court could have unleashed forces that would have transformed our entire species. Think about it. Every time you check your phone and see the time divided into 60-second minutes, you're witnessing the legacy of ancient Indian mathematics that actually made it into our world. Every time you marvel at the precision of modern engineering, you're seeing echoes of techniques that were perfected thousands of years ago. Now imagine if those innovations had been amplified, accelerated, and combined with the most advanced manufacturing and administrative systems of the ancient world. The Indo-Chinese Empire we've explored wasn't just an alternative political arrangement. It was a completely different answer to the fundamental question of what human beings are capable of achieving when they transcend the artificial boundaries that separate cultures, traditions, and ways of understanding the world. The psychological transformation alone would have created individuals whose cognitive abilities were literally centuries ahead of their time, people who could think simultaneously in multiple philosophical frameworks and solve problems using intellectual tools that neither parent civilization could have developed independently. But here's what haunts me most about this alternative timeline: how close it actually came to happening. The intelligence networks were already in place, the military capabilities had been proven through successful campaigns, the economic incentives were overwhelming, the political opportunities were unprecedented. Chinese civilization was fractured and vulnerable in exactly the ways that would have made Gupta conquest not just possible, but inevitable under the right leadership. All it would have taken was for Chandragupta II to receive that crucial intelligence report about Chinese weakness and think like an emperor rather than a king. To see beyond the traditional boundaries of Indian ambition and recognize that the ultimate prize wasn't in the West, but in the North. To understand that true greatness lay not in consolidating existing conquests, but in achieving something that no ruler in history had ever attempted: the unification of the world's two most advanced civilizations under a single visionary leadership. That moment of decision, hanging in the balance during those crucial months of 320 CE, represents one of the great turning points in human history. The conquest that would have changed everything was waiting to be born, poised on the edge of reality, ready to transform not just the ancient world but the entire future trajectory of our species. And as we contemplate what we've lost by not having this alternative timeline, we're forced to confront a profound truth about the nature of historical development itself. The path that humanity actually took, with all its conflicts, limitations, and missed opportunities, was not inevitable. It was simply one possibility among many, one roll of the dice in the great game of civilizational development. The Indo-Chinese Empire that could have emerged from this conquest would have demonstrated that human beings are capable of so much more than we've achieved. That synthesis is possible on a scale we've never imagined, that the future doesn't have to repeat the patterns of the past, that decisions made in moments of possibility can echo across millennia, shaping the destiny of our entire species. The conquest that could have changed everything may never have happened, but its possibility reminds us that we're still making decisions today that will determine the trajectory of human civilization for centuries to come. The same vision, the same courage, the same willingness to transcend traditional boundaries that could have created the Indo-Chinese Empire are qualities we need now more than ever. Because the greatest conquests aren't always military ones. Sometimes they're conquests of imagination, of possibility, of the courage to envision a world that doesn't yet exist but could, if we're bold enough to reach for it. What do you think? Could this alternative timeline have actually happened? What other moments in history represent similar crossroads where everything could have been different? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this journey through the paths not taken has opened your mind to new possibilities, hit that subscribe button and join us as we continue exploring the mysteries hidden in the shadows of human history. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know about the past, because the truth is always stranger and more wonderful than we dare to imagine.